Hi, Daniel. Welcome to our virtual newsroom. So we've known each other for quite some time, starting like 7 or 8 years ago back in NBER, where we worked on the same team. But some of our audience might not know you already. Do you mind just introducing yourself a little bit, who you are, where you studied, and what are some of your current projects?
Hi, Lizzie. Thanks for inviting me on your show. So as you said, I'm Daniel. I'm a final year PhD student at Harvard University, where I work on health policy and economics topics. Most recently, I have worked on research on things like disability insurance, health insurance markets in the United States, as well as a couple of projects related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular, labor markets during COVID-19, both here in the United States, but also jointly with some collaborators from the World Bank in developing countries. Originally, I'm from Hungary. That's where I grew up, and I came to the US 12 years ago as an undergraduate student, and I have been here ever since, although soon I will move back to Europe and start my job in the UK.
I see. Interesting. So, since you already mentioned, last year has been very unexpected in a lot of different ways. And, so now the pandemic isn't over yet, and the world is still in the midst of this health crisis. So when we think of COVID, we primarily think of it as a public health issue. But now, as we see across the world, the economic implications have also been huge in different countries, in developed countries, and also in developing countries. So to get to the meat of their interview, can you first start by telling us or help us understand a little more how COVID is actually affecting the world's economies in a short run and also in mid run and long run?
Yes. So as you said, most people think of the COVID-19 crisis as primarily a public health issue. I think that's actually not even necessarily wrong. So I think a lot of the economic response will need to be sort of start with treating the public health crisis. But so what are the economic consequences of this public health crisis? So I think the economic consequences can be put broadly into 3 buckets. The first are direct economic effects of the pandemic. So COVID-19 causes disruptions both on the demand side and the supply side of the economy. So what do I mean by that? So there are supply side disruptions in the sense that production processes are disrupted. So certain factories cannot run. Say we produce something in China with parts imported from Africa. These export-import linkages are disrupted. So there is this supply side disruption. This is, of course, exacerbated by government responses, lockdown measures that also limit sort of the supply side of the economy. So if the government requires workers to stay at home, then jobs and production processes that can only be performed in person will be disrupted. There is also a demand side disruption, namely that people consume much less. Part of this is because of the government lockdown. So if you are not allowed to go to a restaurant, then you will consume less of restaurants or food produced at the restaurant. Part of it is due to people being afraid to consume, and if you are afraid of being infected, that's why you will not go to restaurants. So this first bucket is the direct effects of supply and demand disruption. But there are what I would call indirect effects. So indirect effects arise because supply and demand disruptions, the direct effects mean that people have a lot less money to spend. Mm-hmm. They both have less money to spend, and there is more uncertainty about their future income. And so this means that I go less to the restaurant. The restaurant owner herself will also have a lower income, and she herself can spend less. So these effects cycle through the economy, causing what economists would call adverse demand amplification. This is basically the idea that the decrease in demand sort of cycles through the economy, and again, I spend less at the restaurant owner has a lower income, she's able to spend less, she's able to buy fewer cars. Now, of course, the car shop owner can also spend less, and so there is this negative cycle. This is exactly the opposite of positive cycles that can arise from for example, increased government spending, which have positive multipliers. When the government spends $1, that has more than $1 effect on the economy. Now this is reversed. The third bucket, in addition to direct and indirect effects, are the potential long-term scarring effects of a recession. This is the idea that the disruption to economic processes and linkages, import and export relationships, employer-employee relationships, when people lose their jobs, will in the longer term decrease potential output in the economy. It's the idea that these relationships are costly to recreate, and so when the shock happens, it will have these negative longer term consequences. For example, after the 2009 recession, we can see that even today, areas that were very hard hit by the recession are doing worse than areas that were less hard hit. So government policy will need to intervene to address these three types of effects: direct, indirect, and longer term scarring effects.
Right. That's super comprehensive. And, when we talk about sort of ways to get out of this pandemic, there are, sort of two answers you frequently hear. First is to tackle the public health crisis, by getting the vaccines out, by getting better treatment and therapeutics, basically. And the second one is sort of from a physical or a monetary point of view. But the monetary tools are probably exhausted. I mean, interest rates are near zero across the world. But now the focus seems to be on the physical side. So, as we, hear on the news on a daily basis, now the Biden administration has put together this COVID stimulus package or rescue package subject to Congress approval. And there's some debate on what exactly is the right number to put in this stimulus package. So, as a public finance expert, can you help us understand what the key elements of this package is? And, from a physical point of view, how would you assess its strengths and weaknesses?
So the Biden administration last month proposed a plan called the American Rescue Plan, which is a very large fiscal stimulus and relief package. So it runs at $1.9 trillion. That's 1,900 billion US dollars. That is very large. That's larger than some of the earlier packages passed by the Trump administration.
Right.
Now, of course, this package needs to pass the US Congress, the House, and the Senate, where Republicans are proposing a more moderate sized, but still very large 400 billion rescue package. The Biden administration's plan contains a number of key elements that I think economists like. One is extending the expanded unemployment benefits with a $400 weekly supplement through the end of September. So this is the idea that people who are unemployed in the United States get paid unemployment benefits. During the early parts of the pandemic, these were increased by $600 a week, but this increase has expired, and the current sort of supplement is set to expire at the end of March, and the Biden administration would extend this to September. The second key element is that the administration would send $1,400 in direct payments to almost all Americans up to a very high income threshold. This would follow on two earlier payments that were sent during the Biden administration. So the idea of the extended unemployment benefits is that a lot of people who have lost their jobs are in a very difficult situation. They need money immediately because they don't have jobs. So this can address sort of the direct effects, but also the indirect effects, because we need people to be able to consume, to stimulate the economy. The idea of the $1,400 direct payment is, I would say, twofold. So it has some, one of the goals is to stimulate the economy by inducing consumption. And the other is to try to give, it's during these types of recessions, it can be very hard to find who are the people, to target the people who exactly need the money. So this would give money to everyone. And then later on, we can implement targeted tax increases on people who didn't really need this money. So it can be ex post targeted. Now, one thing that I should mention is that economists have found during the previous rounds of these stimulus checks is that they are often not very good at stimulating the economy, because most people will end up saving them, particularly as consumption opportunities are few. So for example, I got these previous stimulus checks. I immediately saved them because my consumption has fallen a lot during the pandemic for the simple reason that I'm unable to consume much. And there is research that basically shows by Raj Chetty and his colleagues here at Harvard that shows that low-income people's consumption hasn't fallen much because they still need to consume the same essential things, while relatively high-income people's consumption has fallen a lot because the kind of things that we consume, like I go to the restaurant a lot, cannot be consumed during the pandemic. And this is, of course, the reverse of what has happened to our income. High-income people's income hasn't fallen much because we are able to work from home, while a lot of low-income people have lost a lot of income, either because of hours or because they just lost their jobs or they're unable to work. The package, these are I think the two key fiscal policy elements of the package. It also proposes some investment into vaccination and just getting the vaccine out. That is obviously, there's not much to criticize about that. The public health response and getting people vaccinated is actually the key quote unquote economic policy in this pandemic and this recession. It needs to happen if we want to reopen the economy safely. Right. There are some other smaller elements. The administration is proposing they're raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. I doubt that that will be easy to pass in Congress, though it would certainly be very popular with progressives. There are some tax credits to families to offset childcare costs that I think economists really like because it targets lower income families with childcare needs. It contains some grants to small businesses. Again, kind of almost. It's most economists think it's a good idea, and also it contains an element that gives state and local governments money to bridge their budget shortfalls, which have been substantial during the pandemic and which will be key to mitigate because states and local governments are at the forefront of both the public health but also the economic response.
I see. I'm glad you mentioned the Raj Chetty paper because, when economists think about sort of the effectiveness of a stimulus, there are basically two primary factors we want to think about. First is sort of the propensity to spend or propensity to consume, right? Whether you save the check or you spend the check. So sort of getting that metric right will be crucial to understand how effective that policy actually is. And so there's another factor, I think would be interesting for you to chat a little more, which is sort of the long-term physical effect of, spending this much money. Federal debt level or the budget deficit level of the United States is already at a very high level. So, some economists might worry that, okay, so, now we're in this pandemic, it's important for the government to spend, but once we're over it, how are we going to make up for the deficit we've already accumulated in the past decade or so? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so it is true that both this package and the relief packages passed earlier by the Trump administration will add trillions of dollars to the U.S. Initially, obviously, the budget deficit this year, and then to the U.S. National debt, which is already at record highs. Now, that is, of course, at record highs because over the last several years, despite his promises to cut the national debt, the Trump administration has continued to, in fact, increase the national debt while the economy was doing well. So most economists would suggest that that governments ought to run counter-cyclical fiscal policy, which is the idea of spending more at hard times like recessions, like now, and trying to accumulate budget surpluses when the economy is booming, like prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is something that the Trump administration did not follow. Right now, I don't think policymakers have much of a choice in trying to stimulate the economy. In fact, I would argue that they would be making a huge mistake if worried about deficits. They didn't stimulate the economy. I'm saying that because if you don't stimulate the economy, it will cause what I mentioned earlier, longer-term scarring effects, which decrease longer-term output. And if longer-term output potential is destroyed, that in itself will also drive up budget deficits, right? Budget deficits are not only dependent on your borrowing and your spending, but also dependent on your output. So it would be a mistake to right now focus on the rising debt and not implement sufficient fiscal stimulus. Of course, once this recession is over, it will be key to try to deal with the very high levels of debt. Naturally, if you look at history, it will be hard and policymakers will be quite unwilling to engage. It's always easy to increase spending and it's always difficult to cut back spending or increase taxes. But now is certainly not the time to worry about this.
Yeah, those are very great points. I'm glad that you sort of pointed out that, in the past 4 years, when I talk with people who are not economists, when they talk about Trump administration's sort of accomplishments, the 2017 tax cut was sort of the first thing they mentioned. They're like, "Oh, tax cut is supposed to be a good thing," and I was like, "No, it's not a good thing. You're not supposed to cut tax when the economy is booming." But I'm glad you pointed that part out. And then you also talk about fiscal deficit. And we economists agree with the idea that, when interest rate is low, as it is now, and when the economy is in a recession, it's a good time to, basically just check your spending and deal with the recession right now and worry about deficit later on. But there's also a moral hazard issue, as you correctly point out. Once the economy is out of a recession, then the temptation would be to keep spending and not reducing deficit, because reducing deficit by definition is a counter growth measure. But those are a very great point. Thank you so much for pointing those out. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about your own project. So you also worked as a consultant for World Bank during the COVID pandemic crisis, and you actually had this project with co-authors studying the implication of COVID on the labor market. So can you introduce us to your research a little better? Just help us understand what the data you use, what the methodology you implemented, and what are the key findings?
Yeah, so the project that you mentioned is a collaborative effort with Melanie Cummins from Wesleyan University, as well as 4 economists from the World Bank, David Newhouse, Michal Weber, Utz Pape, and Amparo Palacios Lopez, who work in various parts of the World Bank, the jobs group, the poverty group, and the research department of the World Bank. What we do in this project is examine the early labor market impacts of the COVID-19 recession on a variety of developing countries using high-frequency phone surveys. So in developed countries like the United States or China or European countries, the impacts of COVID-19 can be understood using administrative data sources. So in the United States, we know how many people filed for unemployment each week from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. On the other hand, and this is true across a broad swath of rich countries or relatively high income countries. On the other hand, in poor countries, in developing countries, not much can be known about the impacts of the recession from administrative government data.
Right.
And this is why using surveys is so important.
Right.
It's not the preferred way of assessing economic impacts. If you ask an economist, they would much prefer using administrative data, and most of my own work uses administrative data. But in developing countries, this is kind of what you have to do. And so what we do in this project is examine harmonized survey data from almost 40 developing countries, particularly countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Latin America and the Caribbean region. And what we find is, first, that the COVID-19 pandemic in these countries was very disruptive to labor markets. A lot of people stopped working. A lot of people had to change jobs, had their hours reduced, and sort of there's a host of adverse labor market impacts in these countries. The period that we are studying here is the first half up to June of 2020. We are now looking at more recent data where we can track both the initial recovery, but also the second wave of the pandemic in these countries. Now, in addition to finding that there is a very adverse impact on labor markets in these countries, we also find that these effects don't necessarily match up well with what we see in official GDP statistics and projections, for example, projections released by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So in particular, we find that while in the Latin America and Caribbean region, countries where the IMF predicts a larger impact also had larger labor market disruptions. So you could argue that it's a good match. In sub-Saharan Africa, there is very little relationship between these macroeconomic projections and our findings from the survey. Mm-hmm. So why might that be? We hypothesize that this is because the informal economy is very substantial in sub-Saharan Africa, and changes in the informal economy on the ground are not really captured by official statistics and macroeconomic projections. And I think ultimately these surveys are actually quite useful in trying to capture sort of on the ground impacts as opposed to these longer term macroeconomic projections. And this can be useful to understand which countries, and within countries, which areas were the most impacted and in what ways by the pandemic.
Super interesting. So that's a sort of a project? Do you plan to do anything more on that piece, or have you just put it to sleep, or are you planning on sort of following up surveys and more sort of more in-depth analysis using the data you already have?
Yes, so the World Bank is continuing to field the same surveys in the same set of countries, as well as broadening the set of countries that they are surveying. So, for example, so far we haven't been able to use any data from South Asia, and we have had very limited data from the Middle East and from North Africa. So there is going to be a broadening of the base of countries that we are studying, but there's also going to be a broadening of the time horizon where new surveys were fielded after the initial wave, and now we have surveys going up to the end of 2020 that we will be looking at. And so we can use these follow-up surveys to study the extent to which different countries have recovered, or different countries have recovered in different ways, and also study how different policies implemented by governments have impacted the speed of the recovery and the type of the recovery in labor markets in these countries.
Great. So we'll be looking forward to those data. Final question about yourself. So many of our audience are actually interested in getting a graduate degree in the US, and some of them are interested in getting a public health degree. So Dániel, you're a very accomplished economist. You were also admitted to very top economic programs, as we know. But can you sort of tell us a little bit about your public health program at Harvard, how it is structured, what is a cohort like, and how is it different from like a traditional econ PhD program?
Yeah, so I'm a final year PhD student in Harvard's program in health policy. So Harvard's program in health was an interdisciplinary program that is dedicated to the study of health policies. And this program has several tracks. I am an economist, so I'm in the economics track. But the program also has a statistics track. It has a political science track. It has a decision sciences track and an ethics track. And so what this program does is bring together people with different disciplinary backgrounds who are all interested in studying health policies. And especially in the initial year, allow them to really understand healthcare and health policy in an interdisciplinary way. So, for example, I have a lot of work on disability, and as an economist, I study the optimal way to design disability insurance. But disability has a lot of other aspects. So it has political aspects, how you can pass disability insurance reform, how different stakeholders might think about it. It also has ethical aspects, clearly. Who should you consider disabled? How should you treat them? And this, of course, applies to a lot of other topics in health. There's economic aspects of the optimal design of health insurance, but it's also an ethical question. Who should get priority when healthcare services are limited? And it's also very much a political question, what type of healthcare we have in the United States. Just like, as we just discussed, what type of stimulus can the Biden administration pass? That's as much a political question as it is an economic question. And so what our PhD program does is engage students on all of these different aspects of studying health and healthcare, but it also gives them a very strong disciplinary foundation in their own chosen track, which for me is economics.
Great. Now that's a super interesting intro to your program. Now on to your next career step. So you mentioned at the very beginning of the interview, you'll be moving back to Europe. And can you introduce to us a little bit what your next stop will be and what kind of a project that will bring to you?
Yes, so in fact, I will start a new job actually on Monday, virtually, initially from Boston, and then I will move to London. In April, I will be working at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is a policy and research institute located in London, in the UK. I will be a research economist at IFS, where I will initially manage the IFS's work on tax reform in Ethiopia. I should say this has actually nothing to do with health, so it will be quite different from what I initially studied for my PhD, but I'm quite excited to learn more about other types of policy areas and various types of approaches to fiscal policy design, and also taxation. So congratulations on landing such a great job, and all the best luck for your next endeavors. Thank you so much, Daniel, for this conversation. It has been super helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Lizzie. Thanks for inviting me. Bye. Talk to you soon. Bye.